Hello, everyone. This is Alexander Lucard, and I am an HMIS System Administrator for Montgomery County. In today's training, we're going to look at how to use the APR, the Annual Performance Report, in order to check the data quality of the housing move-in date. In a previous training, we looked at what the housing move-in date meant, what the difference was between the referral date, the project start date, and the housing move-in date, and how to properly record the housing move-in date in HMIS. If you're not sure about any of that, about how to put the housing move-in date into HMIS, how to do an interim for the housing move-in date, how to do shelter points, that is a previous training. Please look through our sets of training, both PowerPoint and video, and you can find the first housing move-in date training. This is an advanced training to show you how to check the data quality. And what we're going to do first is we are going to go to reports. And we're going to go to the COC APR 2019. This report is probably the most important one in all of HMIS. This report is the gold standard for your program. Anyone with an HMIS license should be running this report at least once a month. And this is where you're going to find nearly all of your data errors. Again, you want to use this report so that what you upload into Sage, what you're doing for the AHAR, what you're doing for HUD, all of these things that you do, including your NOFA ranking, are really determined by what you have in this report. So it's really important that you train your staff to the COC APR report and make sure that everyone there with an HMIS license knows how to run it. Running the APR is a separate training as well. Again, this is an advanced training where we're showing you how to use a part of the APR for data quality check. Please find the APR training if you are unsure how to run the APR. We're going to click on it now. Right? And what we're going to do is we are going to choose our provider. The provider is the program we're going to take a look at, the date range, what time period do you want to look up to have the APR report run on, and then your entry exit type. What type of program do you use? Most programs are going to be HUD. The vast majority of programs will choose HUD. I already have a report pre-made in here, and I'm just going to click view so that we can use the pre-populated one. Kind of like in a cooking show where the food's already done. So here's the APR. And this is our test program. It's a fake version of HSP Rapid Rehousing Family for Catholic Charity. Now, here's how we are going to do a search for the quality of your housing move-in date. First thing we're going to do is we're going to note this number here, the total number of persons served. Currently, there are 8 people in the program, and there are 2 adult head of household. And as usual with the APR, anytime you want to see who these numbers represent, you can click on the blue number and a pop-up screen will show up giving you a list. In this case, these are our 2 heads of household, George Jetson and Tom George Test. So we want to remember that because these are our 2 heads of household. And what we're going to do is we are going to scroll down here to sections 7A and 8A. We can see, oh, look, there are 8 people served. We knew that already, 4 adults, 4 children. And here's our housing move-in date for PSH and RRH, the total persons served who moved into housing. The number is 5. 5 out of 8 people are housed within your program. That means 5 of the people that you are currently serving in your program are housed within that program and 3 are not. And what we want to do is we always make sure that we get that right. If you don't have a housing move-in date, your client will not count as being housed within your program. And this is, again, is very important for things like capacity, for utilization, and for most of our funders and the reports that determine, your funding score, things like your NOFA and your SAGE. So you want to absolutely make sure that everyone who is actually housed has a housing move-in date. And you can find that here in line 7A. Line 8A is just the number of households. So we can see total households 2 for PSH and RRH, the total number of people who are being served who have moved into housing. So one family is moved in, one family is not. So one family is missing their household move-in date. Now, it's okay if they're missing their housing move-in date if they haven't actually moved into your program yet. Your housing move-in date is when the client leases up, if you're like a scattered site program, or physically moves into your program if you're an SRO or a PSH, where the program is actually where you house the clients. So your housing move-in date is just going to say, yes, they're leased up and or they have moved into our program. And if we click on the number here, the 5, we can see all the Jetsons are successfully moved in. They've got their housing move-in date. And the other ones that don't, by elimination, are the test family. Remember, we can go up here. We can either click on the total number of persons served, or we can go here to the total under 7A. 7A is really where you're going to want to spend a lot of your time if you're looking at the housing move-in date quality. And it's the same number 8. So we can see there's a family of 3, the tests, that do not have their housing move-in date. And again, it could be that we ran this report the day after they accepted joining your program, so they haven't had a chance to move in yet. But we still always want to double check to make sure that we don't have any data quality errors. So we're going to be looking at that test family, the 3 people out of the 8 that do not have a housing move-in date. And we're just going to make sure that everything lines up. Because right now we know they have an entry exit or they wouldn't be on this report. So now we have to look in 2 other sections. And those 2 sections are within the entry itself. And then we're going to look in shelter point because we want everything to match up. Again, remember, we know that Tom George Test is the head of the family. So we're going to start off by looking at his account. So we're done with the APR for right now. We're going to go to client point. And we're going to look for Tom Test. And there he is. Remember, we want to make sure we grab the right client. As you see, Tim came up because the system is intuitive and looks for similar names or wants to make sure you didn't make a typo. Tim is close enough to Tom that it brought it up. So remember, we want to look for the actual person, Tom George Test, not Tim Test. And if you're still not sure, remember you have the social security number and date of birth, some unique identifiers. And we also have Tom Test's middle name, George, 3 different ways that we can see if we have the right client. We know Tom George Test is the right one, so we're going to click on him now. We don't have to worry about backdating because we're just going to do a quick search of data quality. And now we're going to go to the entry exit tab. You have the entry exits on the summary screen, but you can't see it as well, what we're looking for. Here, we want to go to the entry exit tab. So let's click on it. Now, we can see that Tom George Test has a project start date of 4/8/2021. We want to keep track of that, 4/8/2021. That is a date that he said, his family said, yes, I want to come in to Rapid Rehousing Family HSP from Catholic Charity. That's the project start date. Remember, referral date is the date they were referred to your program. Project start date is the date that they said, yes, they want to be in your program. And housing move-in date is the date they actually moved in or leased up, depending on your program type. Now, when you do a housing move-in date, remember that you need to do an interim. You must do an interim to properly do the housing move-in date. As we can see here, there are no interims done on this client, otherwise a number 1 would appear here. There are no interims done. That says that maybe they don't have a housing move-in date, because if they had one and the data entry person had done this correctly, we'd have an interim done. But we're just going to go into the account and just double check and make sure that they didn't put the housing move-in date in without an interim. We're going to click on the pencil. All the family has a check mark. We hit save and continue. And we scroll all the way down here. Again, remember, there is a spot on the entry exit where you can type in the housing move-in date, but for data quality, you want to make sure you do an interim, even if it's the same date as the project start date. We covered that in the previous training. Please refer to that if you need to. The housing move-in date is blank here. That means that is correct. Without the housing move-in date, the APR, we saw that in the APR, that they didn't have a housing move-in date. We're just double checking here to make sure everything is okay and that there isn't an interim. So far everything is matching up, and it looks like Tom Test's family just actually haven't moved into HSP family yet, which is great because we're seeing data quality. So 2 of the 3 things we want to make sure all line up have so far, and we just have 1 more to go, and that's shelter point. Remember, we go into shelter point when we put the housing move-in date in. We enter a client into shelter point with the housing move-in date. So the housing move-in date and the shelter point date are going to be the same. We're going to pick our provider. I'm going to go right. We're going to pick our provider, and then we were going to click on the view all button. This is really the only one we really have to worry about on the screen in terms of data quality. Oh, and now we have a problem. We can see that George Jetson's family is in here, and so are the tests. Why is it bad that the tests are in here? Because remember, we only enter a person or their family, depending on if you're a singles or family program, we only enter them into the shelter point system when they have a housing move-in date. And we can see that all 3 of the family members are here. So that says to me one of 2 things has happened. Either they forgot to put in the housing move-in date on the entry, or the test family isn't supposed to be on this screen. And this is where it gets a little fun. You get to play detective. That's one of the things I love about cleaning up data in HMIS, because it's kind of a whodunit. It's, why is this coming up as an error? Let's figure out why, and let's solve the problem. This is especially true with income errors. But this is where you get to play, detective and figure out what's the missing piece of the puzzle. So let's do that here. What do we have to fix? Do we have to either remove these people from shelter point because they actually haven't moved in, or did they just forget to do the housing move-in date on the entry screen? Well, there's one big answer right here. A date of 4/12/2021. If you remember, on the entry screen, if we go back to Tom George, we can see that he entered on 4/8/2021. But here, we have to go back like this. On shelter point, we see a date of 4/12/2021. And what does that mean? How do we know where the problem is? Because remember the 3 dates. The referral date is the date that they are referred to your program. Start date is the date that they agree to join your program, and move-in date is the date that they actually moved into your program or leased up. I know I keep bringing this up, but I want to make sure you know the difference, because this is one of the most common errors you're going to see in regards to the move-in date. And here we see that while the entry date is 4/8, the date that they were entering to shelter point is 4/12. There's a date of 4 days difference. And what that says to me is that this is the housing move-in date, that they accurately entered them into shelter point on 4/12/2021, the date that they moved into the program, leased up, whichever it is, but they forgot to do the interim on the entry exit screen. Remember, you need to do both. You have to do the housing move-in date interim, and you have to enter them in to shelter point. You have to do them both. And one of the most common mistakes with the housing move-in date here in Montgomery County is that you do one but not the other. You either put it in the shelter point, but you forget to do the interim, or you do the interim and you forget to put them in shelter point. So here we see 1, 2, 3 need to have their interim done with a date of 4/12. So we're going to do that now. We're going to make sure that everything is correct. So let's go to Tom George. We're going to click on the entry exit, and we're going to click on the interims button. Right? We're going to add interim review. We're going to make sure the whole family is checked, so we only have to do one interim. Remember, if each family member is checked, the interim will be duplicated in each account, which means you only have to do it once instead of 3 times, once for each member of the family. We're going to do an update, and we're going to do it for a date of 4/12. 4/12/2021. The timestamp really doesn't matter in this case for the interim. So why did we choose 4/12? Because that was the housing move-in date on shelter point. And we want to make sure that they both match up, because remember, the date that they're entered into shelter point is the housing move-in date. And if we're doing an interim for the housing move-in date, both dates should be the same. So let's hit save and continue. What we're going to do is we're going to find the right bubble here. We're going to choose COC ESG Update 2020. Don't worry about the name. And the first thing that comes up is the housing move-in date. And all we're going to do is we're going to do 4/12/2021. That's what we do with the interim. We don't have to worry about any of the other parts. We just want to make sure that the HUD verifications are done as long as we're in here. And we look for any other errors like this. We have Medicaid is yes, but we don't have the Medicaid ID. So what we'd want to do is go back and get that ID as well, because that's missing and we want 100% data quality. We hit save and exit. We can't answer these questions, so we say no. And now look, we have an interim for 4/12/2021, which is the housing move-in date. Again, 4/12/21. The shelter point was 4/12/2021, so everything adds up. So now we're going to go into reports and we're going to go to COC APR. Now remember, we have this already pre-done APR, right? So what happens if we click on that? All right. And we can see if we go down here to 7A, oh look, they aren't showing up as properly housed. Why? Because this APR is an old version and it keeps the stats from the time and date that we ran the report at. So when we just made a change, this old copy of the APR is going to reflect the old information. We have to run a new APR for this family. All right. So we're going to do that now. We're going to do 0101. We keep the same parameters, HUD, HSP. We're going to build report. And we're building a new version of the report, one up to date, because this one's 3 days old. So it's only going to contain information as of April 19th, 2021 at 2:46 in the afternoon. This new report is building it on 4/22 at 5:34. So even though it's the same date range as the previous APR we looked at, there's a 3 days difference, hopefully maybe 3 days worth of correction. Let's click on the magnifying glass to bring up the report. And let's go down. And now we can see all 8 members of the family are housed properly. And both families are housed properly. Why? Because we did the housing move-in date properly by putting in a housing move-in date interim. So what we saw here is one of the most common errors people make with the housing move-in date, besides forgetting to do it at all. Oftentimes they will put it into shelter point, but they'll forget to do the housing move-in date interim, or they'll do the housing move-in date interim, but forget to put them in shelter point. And by using the APR, we can double check and make sure that the housing move-in date is completed. Categories 7A and 8A are where you're going to look in the APR to make sure that your data quality is correct regarding the housing move-in date. That's our training for today. I hope you learned something from this. And please join me back for more of these recorded trainings, either in PowerPoint or in video form. Thank you very much again for joining me today, and I look forward to doing another training with you down the road. Have a great day.